So while people are still coming in, let me take the opportunity to welcome our guest of today's session. So this is Elizabeth Blankespoor from the University of Washington. Beth has worked extensively, I can say, on the topic that we're going to discuss today. Various disclosure channels, ranging from social media to IPO roadshows um, and I think what really sets her work apart from a lot of the other stuff that I've been reading is that she always thinks about the conceptual structure of these disclosure channels. And so I was very excited, I have to say, when she directly agreed to do this unit and this discussion session. And in particularly so, because as you can see from the slide deck, she is based on West Coast US. That means it's way early in the morning for you. And I think you deserve an extra prize for doing this. So without further ado, Beth, over to you. You know that everybody knows the drill. So we're going to have a presentation by Beth for roughly 15 minutes about, and then we will have a list of questions. And if you have additional questions, feel free to put them into the chat at any time and we will call on you. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Beth. Thanks for doing this again, and over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. And thanks for setting it all up. Been having a nice set of videos and nice set of presentations and preparations for all of this. So it's always fun to talk about good research. I'm going to talk about disclosure channels today. And I always like to, set things up conceptually, and I like to do it with pictures. So here we go. We think about corporate disclosure, right? The first thing, that the most basic concept is you have a company, and then you have investors that it's talking to and it's providing information to. But that's at a pretty simple level. And the reality is there are lots of ways that they send that information to investors, many different channels. And the classic is the 10K filing and the press release. More recently, it's been things like annual meetings, conference calls, websites even. And the thing about these different channels is that they can affect this information communication, investor processing, and market behavior because of what I'm going to call two big reasons. And the first one is the very straightforward. If you have more ways to get the information across, then that means more dissemination. That means more opportunities for investors to see the information, to get it, to process it. And so this idea that channels can increase dissemination and thus reduce information processing costs is kind of that starting point. And what I mean, you've already had this nice introduction, so I'm going to fly through this part about information processing costs. You start with disclosure and the end goal is a trade. First, you have to know that the information is there. You have to be aware of it. And then you have to actually get it, to acquire it. And that means, can be simple, can be difficult. And then you have to figure out what to do with it. You have to integrate it. And at each of those stages, there are costs to getting this information, to becoming aware of it, to acquiring it, to integrating it. And along that path, then, dissemination across different channels can help overcome some of those processing costs. Now, in the review paper that you would have read, we talk about variation in disclosure processing costs coming from four different sources. The first is this intra-investor variation. That just means you hold the disclosure constant and you hold the investor even constant, right? Same person, same disclosure. And at different times, they're going to be more or less able to process, whether it's different times of the week, different times of the day, when you're hungry or not. So there are all different factors that can lead to same investor, same disclosure, different costs. Another is the inter-investor variation. That means some investors are going to be better able to process disclosure than others, depending on their sophistication or experience or background. The third is that there are differences in how costly it is to process across firms and disclosures. So some firms are just more complicated. That introduces more processing costs. Some firms have more complicated language around things, whether it was intentional or unintentional. Some firms better disseminate or broadcast their information. And then the last group is market technologies, that these can come in and start to affect these costs, whether it's for just a subgroup or for an entire capital markets worth of information. So what we're going to talk about today, and what that first example that I gave of how does dissemination matter, or how do disclosure channels matter, it's dissemination. This is our little radio broadcast signal. But essentially, this just means that if you can disseminate a given disclosure more broadly, that's going to reduce the awareness costs and the acquisition costs of getting that information. So that's kind of this first main way that it can affect. And the other aspect that I wanted to kind of raise, I'm talking about firm disclosure and firms providing the information, but there are also, you can introduce intermediaries in that sometimes intermediaries will help extend that dissemination that firms do. And you can think of those as a different disclosure channel where they're getting an extra signal boost from these different intermediaries. And that can help with all kinds of processing costs, the awareness, the acquisition, and the integration. Now, be careful to not extend this too far. Intermediaries are not the firm, but you'll see this as another way for information to be disclosed and reach a broader audience. So some examples of the empirical literature that has looked at just this basic concept of more channels means the information gets out there further. It's ranged from open conference calls. They used to be closed and then they became open. And then media outlets covering earnings announcements leading to greater liquidity, looking at firms further disseminating using Twitter, and that can lead to greater liquidity. And then these last three are all media coverage. Again, media coverage of insider trading, these news flash coverage of management guidance, and then robo articles coverage of earnings announcements. So looking at these different components, again, we see kind of this evidence of more price reaction, more liquidity at times, greater price formation, quicker price formation at different times. So some general evidence that more channels means the information gets out there more quickly. So that's kind of the first foundation of how channels can really matter. Now, the second is where you really get to dig into the details. And I get super interested in this part because it all depends on the channel. So a lot of these channel features can come in and they might encourage or allow, meaning that the way that they're structured, it's going to encourage firms to think about things differently, disclose them differently. It might also facilitate different reactions. It means that investors might come in and react in a different way or interact in a different way. And so the core of this just means when you put information on a different channel, you might end up with a different disclosure, different information. You might end up with different processing costs because of the way that the channel portrays the information or who it reaches. And you might end up with different investor interpretation of the information because of the features of that channel. So let me get into that a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about some research on it too. So we're back to our same picture of the firm disclosing to investors. When we think about disclosure, right, you have to consider that the decision is what are you going to say? How are you going to say it? Who is going to say it? These are all features of the disclosure. And we think about how does that play out? Well, like how long is it? What are the words that are being used? Can you have audio cues? Can you have visual cues? Who is saying it, the firm or the manager? Can the investors respond and interact, or is this a one-way communication? So these are all kind of features to think about in a channel. And when we bring in social media, now suddenly the potential features gets much, much broader. Before that, you did have aspects of this in different channels, but with social media, now a lot of these are often shorter. So the fact selection becomes more important. Not all of them, some of them are shorter. The typical wording style is often going to be more informal. So that again changes the way that firms are thinking about their disclosure and potentially changes the processing costs. There's more ability or more opportunity to incorporate these visual cues. This idea that you can put in static pictures, you can put in dynamic video. Sometimes these are actually expected in the platform. It's more individualized in general, or at least even if you do the firm, it is seen, there are chances to portray it as an entity that people are interacting with, in part because social media was designed for individuals to interact. So it changes the kind of perceptions and the way that it's done. Also, ability for investors to respond and interact. So they can respond and they can respond directly to firms and everyone can see them do that. And then there are lots of opportunities for investors to interact on different platforms. So I just threw up, 4 more platforms that are much more about interacting among investors than necessarily with an investor to a firm. So it brings in another layer of potential interactions among these investors. So this is a kind of chart that you can see in a 2018 review paper that I did or discussion. So this is essentially the same kinds of things that we've been talking about just now, but in a more structured format. So on the left-hand side of the screen, this is just the information packet, right? What am I saying? How am I saying it? Who is saying it? And that disclosure packet, it can, all the red words are how social media can start to affect the information packet, whether it's the length of the limit, the richness of the information in there, the informality, who's presenting. And then you go along the dissemination on the top, and there are more channels because of social media, and they're reaching potentially new kinds of investors that weren't interested or didn't get information before. So those are the red investors. And then you move down here on the right-hand side, and you can see that investors were always processing information, but now potentially you've got different kinds of investors getting involved with different abilities to process. And when they're processing it, now there's also this new information about credibility can be influenced by these different aspects, features of the individual, whether it's the company or whether it's other investors. So credibility starts to matter more. The context, there can be context-specific expectations of what is okay to do in a given platform and what is not okay. And then there are more ways for investors to respond publicly. This public response, which sometimes incentivizes managers to go ahead and respond back to them. So it changes the kind of communication structure that we see here in really interesting ways that can sometimes change the predictions for how the capital markets are going to respond as well. So some of the research that we've seen in this, first just thinking about social media as a firm disclosure channel. One is that sometimes these features can really help us understand and observe the existing ways that we communicate so we can answer some of these classic questions. And I would call this dissemination question one of these classic questions of, does it help to try to get it out in different channels? Normally, it's harder to distinguish between the two. Twitter, by including hyperlinks, it really allowed us to isolate dissemination from disclosure. So that was a place where we could see that there was lower information asymmetry because of that greater dissemination. But another area to think about research is to see if the features change the communication possibilities. So there might be some new opportunities to strategically disseminate, where before that was more difficult to accomplish. Now firms have the opportunity. At the beginning of Twitter, there wasn't much evidence of just strategic dissemination. In later samples, there was some evidence that managers were more likely to disclose the good news than to disseminate the good news than the bad news on Twitter. There's also, it brings opportunities to alert consumers quickly, right? So in this Lee Hutton Shoe paper, they have an opportunity to quickly alert consumers for product recall, but it also brings up an opportunity for consumers and for public negative response to really come in and change the communication pattern. So we see some evidence that interaction can influence what happens for given disclosure. There's some evidence in the Zhu et al. Paper that the kinds of conversations can vary based on the platform, that Twitter's conversations start and end quickly, and Facebook start slower but continue on for longer. So understanding those features. And then this final group was just that there are new opportunities for employees to disseminate. So employee opinions on Glassdoor predict future accounting information and returns. And then the question is, well, are employees the firm or are they intermediaries? I don't know. It's blurring the line of who is really doing the disclosing here. There's another whole set where the social media is the intermediary. And I think this is the part that has been getting more attention in more papers. They're both interesting. In this one, there's just evidence when you look at things like Seeking Alpha and Twitter and Glassdoor that posts on there are informative for future returns, for future earnings. There's some evidence that credibility is a potential concern. And this is an interesting area where people are starting to get into. There are different characteristics on the platform that help to mitigate the concerns about credibility, but it doesn't always work. So there's some different papers on this, kind of an interesting area to look into. And then this last piece is that, yes, social media can help things, but it's not all good news. It's not, it's not always helpful. and so this is a paper that looked at when can it distort information flow. And they looked at merger rumors on social media and found that when rumors had more Twitter activity to spread them around, that they had a greater market reaction, even though that greater activity on Twitter was not at all associated with their probability that it would actually result in a rumor or in a merger. And so this idea that you get more dissemination when it doesn't actually seem warranted, then you have price distortion after that. And in fact, this happened more when you have Twitter users with more influence. So suggests that credibility plays an important role in this. So that's kind of this a very quick overview with some framework on how to think about these different channels. Now, here's a specific example of a working paper that I have right now, where we're looking at two different disclosure channels. And it's looking at it in the context of firms that are trying to raise capital from investors during the IPO, and they have to explain the company and its prospects. So in this case, you have investors providing capital to managers. Managers have to give investors information to predict that future performance. And they have two distinct channels to do it in. One is this written disclosure, the S1 filing. It's really regulated. It's very formal written documents, comprehensive. I don't know if any of you've looked at them, but it's enormous and slightly overwhelming. And then the other channel are these manager presentations during the roadshow. And in this is more flexible. It is usually the manager providing their manager has more control over what's being said. It's informal. It's a spoken presentation directly to a small group of investors, and it's a summary rather than a comprehensive. So we asked, one, do they differ? Here we have essentially supposed to be the same information sent on two different channels in two different ways. Do we see that the form of communication differs? And then second, assuming that there is that difference, do we see that the roadshows can predict future firm performance or the filing disclosures? And so we would expect, on one hand, the S1 filing to be really informative, right? This is broad collaboration. You're bringing in everyone who knows everything about the company, the underwriters, the lawyers, the managers, all these different groups. And there's a lot of regulatory oversight. The SEC comes in, they give feedback on this. We would expect it to be fully informative. Whereas the roadshow, this is just managers talking. They get a lot of flexibility in this. They have a lot of incentives to try to come across as positive and avoid these negative topics because they want that investment. The counter argument is that, filings, yes, they're regulated, but that could be overregulation. It could be boilerplate. It could be redundant. It could mean that there's information in there, but it also has really cautious disclosures along with it. Whereas roadshows are from the manager. It's their perspective. The investors all say this is really important. They won't invest without actually seeing it. And so those incentives of trying to come across as very positive, they also don't want their stock price to drop immediately after they go public. So they're tempered by market constraints as well. So there's some tension here about which both are going to be informative. We looked at 345 IPO firms from 2011 to 2014. And what we found is that, one, these roadshows, they're more positive, they are less negative, and they are less uncertain than the written S1 filings. So not that surprising in the context of this is they have the incentives to come across as more positive. They don't have that regulatory oversight, so they don't have to be as cautious in the disclosures. And that's what we see. So the follow-up question is, well, is that because they're talking about different topics, different things, or are they talking about the same topics, but in different ways? So we used machine learning to classify first the S1, we classified them based on the table headings into 5 general categories within that filing, the section headings within the filing. And then we used machine learning to classify the roadshow sentences into those same topics based on the way that the S1 filings were classified. And what you can see is that the S1, they're fairly evenly split across business topics, MD&A and financial statements, risk management, and then some smaller ones. Whereas the roadshow, 80% of the sentences are related to the business, which is what we would expect. They're in there to talk about the business and try to get investors in that way. So they do change the topics discussed. But when we look at the textual characteristics of those topics, we also see, then the question is, well, in the S1, what's interesting is the business section is the most positive, and it is less negative and less uncertain than some, at least, of the other sections. But we also see that within that business section, the roadshow filing is more positive than the business section of the S1. It's less negative and it's less uncertain than that same business section in the S1. So essentially, the answer is yes, they changed the topics, and yes, they changed the way that those topics are discussed. And you can kind of see in the paper too, some different words in here too, where we laid out what does this look like? They all have positive, negative, and uncertain words. Some of the words are the same. Those are the ones with the overlap in the 2 circles, but many of them are different, showing again that these channels, they have different ways of communicating within these different channels, different words that they end up using. Okay, then we look at the performance of this and see that roadshow linguistics predict future firm operating performance, this ROA. We look at the 3 years going forward, and we don't really see that with the S1. And when we look at this under different specifications, the positive and the uncertain words within that roadshow are the best predictors of future firm performance. So we see some evidence that these management summaries are actually meaningful. And when we summarize them down, they can help predict future performance, kind of coming back to that idea of corporate transparency, that different channels can have different implications for this corporate transparency. We also do a small analysis where we say, let's look at this positive language and see, are there some that are, can we even further dig down and say the positive words that are used as buffers versus the ones that are helped to frame negative, right? It is positive sandwich versus ones that are not associated with the negative words. And what we see is that there are far more of these non-buffering positive words, meaning unequivocally positive. They're not sandwiched right next to a negative. There are more of those non-buffering in the roadshow, right? Again, consistent with this idea of there isn't as much of this cautious disclosure. And when we look at this same kind of prediction, the words that are predictive the most of future performance are these non-buffer positive words, whether you're in the roadshow or the S1. So part of it is this idea that you don't have to have the negative statements so close to it. Overall, right, we look at roadshow presentations, we found they're more positive, less negative, less uncertain, and that these roadshow linguistics predict that future operating performance, suggesting that the channel has some implication for transparency here. And that more generally, disclosure channels can affect the way that disclosure is done and what corporate transparency means for the company. All right, I'm a little over, but that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. So, and no worries about running over time. So that's entirely fine because what you had to tell us was very exciting, I guess. So now we will move over to the question bit. And you all know how it's been organized. So we're going to start with a series of questions that are more or less related to the paper. And then we will move over to some more general questions. And time permitting, we also have some meta questions towards the end that are even more broad, right? So, and I informed Rusha that she will have the responsibility to ask the first question. So feel free to introduce yourself if you want and fire away.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for your presentations. I really find the use of graphics very interesting and it's so easy to understand. So I'm Rusha and I'm a PhD student from NHH Norway. And my first question is based on the 2021 roadshows paper that you just presented. So in that paper, you find that roadshows have more information that can predict future accounting performance compared to SEC registration S1 filings. But the roadshows are only accessible by certain investors, for example, institutional investors, analysts, and some selected investors. So do you think this increases the information asymmetry between institutional and retail investors?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I didn't get into the process a lot, right? These roadshow presentations, they are done in those 2 weeks right before a firm goes public. And they are given to institutional investors, right? The investment bank calls up their friends and they say, hey, come sit in this room and you can hear this. And that's why back in kind of the early 2000s, investors complained to the SEC and said, this isn't fair. I want to see these too. And they had the rules that were passed that essentially broadened access to these different presentations. Now, investors, they don't get to, individuals don't get to go into the room and listen, but firms have to either provide the information and they have to provide a transcript, or what most of them do is they provide the actual video, a representative video. It's usually the first one that they do on the internet during the period of the roadshows. So for that 2-week period, anyone can access it. You can access it. We did access it during the 2 weeks that it was on, and that's how we got our data. So in that sense, it is publicly available and everyone can access it. Now, does that mean that they get the same amount out of it? Oh, probably not. There's also a Q&A section after the presentation that we don't have access to. There's definitely some conversation happening. Now, they shouldn't give material new information in any of that. But I'm sure you've all heard this idea of mosaic theory, where you can take little pieces and combine them and suddenly it becomes material. So, on one hand, I think that this legislation that there's regulation that increased access to the roadshows, I think it's great. And that would definitely reduce that information asymmetry between the two groups. It won't eliminate it completely, though.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is another question that originally would have been asked by Mirjab Sohail from Oulu, Finland. He called in sick today and said I should read the question for him, and I will luckily do so. This is related to your findings. And so Mirjab was asking the question, well, how can this be? How can it be that the that the roadshow positive language predicts future accounting return, when in the end, there the possibility for manipulation is much higher and compared to the S1 findings. So you already alluded to this a little bit, but let me pinch this question a little bit and is it possible that maybe these two disclosure channels are actually related, so that they cannot tell us stories because there's the S1 in the background? Is this a feasibility, or so why is it? Why this surprising finding?
Yeah, so I would completely agree with you. That's what I was going to be. That would be part of my answer, is that we're not saying, oh, just get rid of the S1 and we can just have the roadshow and it will be fine. The reality is that the roadshow is a summary that is still somewhat disciplined by that S1. If they say things that are not supported by the S1, investors will say, well, wait, that's not what it says in the S1. And suddenly they will be caught out. And so the fact that you have this regulated, comprehensive document as the base gives actually, I think, greater freedom for managers to really focus on what they think is important, without having this kind of litigation concern of, I didn't tell you every little piece of information. And it also stops them from emphasizing too much and ignoring the important negative information. So I think they do work together. And the other aspect is that we're not saying that the S1 is not informative at all. It's that the summary of that, if you try to summarize it in this kind of this linguistic way, that's not as informative as the roadshow, suggesting that, yes, there's good information in the S1. There's also kind of mildly useful or maybe not useful information in the S1, whereas the roadshow is much more focused on the very most useful information that they can focus on, in part because, or they're encouraged to focus on in part because there is that S1 with all the information in it. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. So Rusha, you had a follow-up question related to the quiet period, I think.
Yeah. So my second question is also based on the same paper. So actually the roadshows are allowed during the IPO quiet period. And the rule is that the companies cannot include more information in the roadshows than is included in the S1. But the IPO quiet period, but according to your findings, the roadshows provide more information compared to S1. So does the IPO roadshow kind of defy the concept and the purpose of the IPO quiet period? Is it, say, a type of violation of the IPO quiet period? That was my question.
Yeah. And so that, this idea that this is related to the second one. How is this possible? And maybe they're telling us new information. That is possible, right? Of course, managers can do all sorts of things, but the reality is that they're not supposed to. The SEC has said that this roadshow should not introduce new information. To the extent that it does, they're putting themselves at risk for litigation. So there's that aspect of things. And so if we start with the basis of the roadshow doesn't include new information, how could our results be there? It would be because of the selection of information, the way that they're discussing it. So there's information in the sense that they told us 100 facts earlier, and now they're saying these 20 facts are the most important. And let me talk more about those. But it's not that those 20 facts that they gave are new. They were already there in the filing, and investors would have just had to search through the filing and know enough to pick those out as the most important. And that's kind of the key part. So does that mean there's not new information? Well, it's kind of information that they said, these are the 20 most important, but they're not giving you new information in the sense of a new fact. And I think that's the key part. This quiet period is supposed to be, the SEC wants investors to know that they can go to the S1 and get everything they need. And that could still be true. And yet looking at the roadshow gives you a more narrow, summarized version that actually is easier and more focused on future performance, on conveying those prospects of the company. So that's how it can be fine regulatory because they're not giving you new facts. But that summary is what's helpful. And now that's based on an assumption, right? It's very difficult to conclude that they haven't given new information. And we haven't seen evidence that they did, but we didn't test. I think that would take reading through everything and then interpreting, is this new or is this not? One thing that helps give comfort that it's probably not driven by new information is that if you have one new piece of, one new fact in a roadshow, and then the whole rest of the roadshow is not new, our measure is going to be predominantly affected by the not new information, right? We're using a summary measure of all of the words in the roadshow. So even if there were one new statement, our measure is really the summary of all of the statements. So in that sense, there's no way that a company would have all completely new facts in a roadshow. That would be very obvious to the field. And so in that sense, our measure, even if there is new information, our measure is focused on the summary of all the information, which would be predominantly what's already found in the S1.
Thank you. That was really insightful. Thank you.
Perfect. So we have another question that was originally asked by Lisa Lübke, and she asked me to read out the question for her. And another question from the chat that was sent to me as a direct message that to some extent relates to this. And this is centered on the question of information overload. So if we subscribe to your interpretation of your findings, that would mean that the real benefit that these roadshows bring is that they summarize information and that they point, let's say, to the more important bits. And I find this to be reasonable, right? So now, if this is really so helpful, then of course, all the notes that we see from financial statements and all the disclosures that these poor corporations file with the SEC, they might lead to just an excess amount of information where our, let's say, stakeholders need these pointers. So can you think about other settings besides IPO where, let's say, a more summarized measure of information could be helpful?
Oh, so I mean, this is what we're hoping to we're doing it within the IPO context, but the broader, one of the broader messages is that management summaries can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think the concern is that's within the IPO setting also exists outside the IPO setting, right? As soon as we give managers leeway to summarize what they want, their incentive that there is going to be motivation to summarize it down to only the good points. Let's not talk about the negative. Let's not talk about the difficult. And so that tension is something that our paper says, well, actually, when they have that tension, this summary is helpful. It is predictive and informative. So I could definitely see it extending to different kinds of settings besides the IPO. I mean, we already kind of see that in this, in the earnings announcement and the press release area where there are these potential highlights that they can put at the beginning or what they choose to put in the earnings press release as opposed to what's in the 10K. So that's something that others have started to look at, which I think is great. And I think the more that we can look at a setting where managers have a chance to summarize, that's helpful because part of the, in looking at these different areas, one, you want to understand how are these two disclosures related? So the advantage that we have in our setting is that the roadshow is not supposed to have new information. It is supposed to draw from that S1. And the second piece of that is there's not a whole lot of other information out for the firm, right? The S1 has come out. That is kind of the complete picture. And then the roadshow comes out and tries to summarize the complete picture also. Both of those documents have a similar goal, which is let me tell you about my company and tell you all those pieces. Now, in different settings, it gets a little bit murkier, right? Is the goal of the earnings press release the same as the goal of the 10K or the same as the goal of the conference call? Well, not quite. It gets a little bit murkier. And they can pull in past information, then the information set, they don't have to just talk about what was in the 10K or the 10Q. They could go to prior 10Ks and prior 10Qs. So the empirical logistics, the empirical research design becomes slightly more difficult. But I think that the question definitely exists. And so, that could be one answer to the concern about information overload and too much information, which is to whether it's encourage these voluntary summaries or to mandate voluntary summaries. And there's been some research kind of talking about this and alluding to this. And I think this is a really interesting and potentially useful answer, given that we can understand in that specific setting, would the summary be helpful? And are there the same, I think, Joachim, you mentioned at the beginning, this interplay, or what I would call this interdisciplinary action, that the S1 disciplines the roadshow to stay in shape. So we want to still have those same kinds of features of discipline if we want the management summary to work in whatever setting we're talking about. So yes, I think it could definitely carry over, but I think we should research that. We should see for the settings of that specific area, the characteristics of that specific setting.
Yeah. Thank you. So I also want to stress this one point that you made that I also very much liked when I read the paper. So that this S1 versus roadshow setting is so clean that it's really that it can directly relate to the information being very comparable. And whenever you have subsequent disclosures, ongoing disclosures, then of course it becomes much more tricky. But still, I think it would be super interesting to learn more about this. I have a follow-up question, but I leave this to the end to see where we still have time, so not to steal time from the students. David, you would be next. Now we are moving on to questions that are no longer strictly related to the paper, so it gets a little bit more broad. And you will see that we have a bunch of paper questions that also relate to IT and the role of IT in information dissemination. So, David, over to you.
Yes. Thank you for a great presentation. It was really interesting. And in your review, I found the part about managers using processing costs strategically very interesting. And I thought about a lot of the recent technology that we are using today, such as XBRL and textual analysis and such. And I'm wondering whether you think that managers has even more discretion now than before, because now they have even more wiggle room when it comes to manipulating the processing costs. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are, and whether the difference between voluntary disclosure and mandatory disclosure is more, or is a bigger difference between those today than previously. So I think that sums up my notes there. Yes.
Yeah, that's good. So, I think the answer to this is yes and no, right? So the more that we have these characteristics, hold on, sorry, you moved over and I can't find you now. Okay, I see you. So the more that we have these characteristics, these tools, the more that investors have the tools, the more that they are able to not worry about how managers do it. So you talked about managers having these ability to influence the processing costs. Well, if the manager has all of the tools and none of the investors do, then they would have a lot of ability to change how they said things and realize that investors are not going to find it. So an example was I saw an article talking about, I think it was Tesla, that had a press release where they took a key part where it said the word Bitcoin and they turned it from text that was searchable into an image that was not searchable. So you would say, oh, what? Wait, what? You made this not searchable. So on one hand, that increases the processing costs for investors that are using these tools that are text searchable. On the other hand, there are probably investors that can have tools that search through images and pull out the text. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that investors with these same tools are going to be able to unwind different actions that managers take. So on one hand, it reduces managers' ability to try to influence processing costs in a strategic way. The investors, they have the tools and they can start to disentangle what's happening and they can do it quickly. On the other hand, could managers, knowing the tools that they have, adjust their disclosure in order to change those processing costs? And yes, right. One was exactly the example I said. If you know that everyone's using text searching algorithms that then do analysis based on the words that they find, you make the words you don't want them to find not text searchable. There's another paper that's looking at, after Lockard and McDonald released their word list, do firms start to strategically not use the words that are negative on the negative word list, knowing that there will be algorithms that will do it? And the answer is, yeah, they can do this. Will they get away with it for long? Not if the tools keep getting better, right? And that's where the more that we have kind of machine learning that can adapt all those aspects, I don't want to say it's an arms race, but this idea that both sides have the tools, it helps to reduce some concerns that those processing costs would be manipulated by managers. And I think the other thing to consider is that, yes, of course, there is the incentive to manipulate, but I think there's also the incentive for managers to make it easier for their investors, and that they're trying to get information across. And so the existence of these tools makes it easier to reduce those processing costs for investors. So I guess, yeah, the answer is complicated, yes and no. And it really depends on the tools and the setting and the skill of the people involved.
Yeah, thank you. It was really insightful.
Thank you. So I think I recall papers that look into firms deliberately misclassifying XBRL tags in order to make it harder for people to understand. And I'm not sure whether you are aware, but we are currently rolling out the same thing in Europe. So this is on our agenda to look a little bit into how European firms are picking up on this. But I personally also think that it's always a dumb idea to think that one is the smartest person in the room. So if a firm does this, then maybe it could backfire badly with investors that actually see through this stuff. So now we are moving. We're moving on to some questions from Jeremiah, who also is interested in the role of let's say cost and fixed cost in particular when it comes to the adoption of new technology here. So Jeremiah, over to you.
Yeah. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for the lovely lucid talk. And sort of picking up on some of the topics that David was talking about, it feels like in your 2020 review, some of the ways in which the digital implementation costs are considered don't really square with the sort of the economics or the way one would expect the cost of implementation of a digital disclosure to actually work. And so the couple of things that sort of seem to come up when I was reading that are, on the one hand, sort of most of these digital standards have sort of more of a lump sum or a one-time implementation cost, and then sort of very low ongoing maintenance. Also on the enforcement side, often you can do the enforcement via sort of automatically via computer, where then sort of what you say in the review that there's little evidence on whether the benefits of the regulations for, say, XBRL outweigh the cost of implementation. It's hard to think about what where significant costs of implementation really might be coming from, or enforcement costs coming from. And then there's another piece about sort of the distribution of the benefits between the very sophisticated investors and then sort of smaller investors, a little bit lower resourced, and where you highlight that the more sophisticated investors got more early on, got sort of greater advantage. But you would think that maybe, that if it's a software-defined advantage, the software can also be provisioned to the less sophisticated investors moving sort of down the line. And maybe the last piece of the question is when you were answering the previous question, talking about how there's sort of active obfuscation going on in, say, the XBRL tags to maybe change the way in which the disclosures are interpreted, and then sort of this arms race with machine learning, that seems to imply that there are almost negligible disclosure costs, and actually they're so low that there's excess resources that can be devoted towards additional obfuscation. And so what I wonder, just thinking about the research or the analysis pipeline, where you think the firm has, say, a lot of raw business data, they take that raw business data, put it into a text disclosure, pump it into Edgar, and then you have the researchers or the analysts running, or the firms running, or the traders running NLP, and they're doing an interpretation and then acting on it. Do you see sort of that collapsing to where you're actually just offering machine readable data, and maybe not even on a quarterly basis, but just on an ongoing stream, and that sort of cutting out this whole weird sort of paper process that it feels more historical than necessary?
Okay, those are some thick questions. All right, I'm going to take them one by one. And first talk about this idea of what are the implementation costs and are they really big or not? And you're talking about Edgar, which is this online electronic system where we have all the filings, and then XBRL, which is a new technology that came into the US around 2009, 10, 11, where each item in those financial statements is tagged electronically so that it's machine readable. So you're right in that, the bulk of the costs came in, or a large amount of costs came in the implementation, whether that's from the regulators implementing it and the standard setters for the XBRL, or the firms implementing it. But if you look at the ongoing costs, it is not trivial in the sense that, with Edgar, they're constantly changing it, revamping it, making it better. With XBRL, every year, the FASB, they have a dedicated taxonomy group. So you think about the FASB as writing standards. Every time they write new standards, they have to bring in new tags. They also have to kind of keep continually improving the tags that they have. They're constantly talking with people who use the data to say, oh, you want to know how an extension tag, which is the firm created one, how that relates back to a standard tag. Oh, well, maybe we could create something in the structure of XBRL that would help with that. So they're working on that aspect. They're working on how to handle, can you use dimensions, which is a way of kind of almost you put a sticker on the tag to say it's this kind of revenue. Can you use dimensions on the face of the financial statement? So they're constantly working to improve the function of that taxonomy, as well as adjusting it for new standards and new approaches or new problems that come up. So that's something about the ongoing costs of doing that. And that's a continual process and a cost. From the firm's perspective, they also have to keep figuring out, one, how to deal with the changes in the taxonomy, two, how to deal with the changes that their own company has, and then three, can they tag things better? Because there are choices in how you tag it. It's not a clean cut version. So in that sense, I would say there are ongoing, I've had many conversations with the group that's dedicated their entire working life to this and continue to dedicate it. So there are still costs. Now, are those greater than what the benefits are? I don't know. I think that's something that people should investigate, right? Like that's what would be interesting to see. The second piece of that, where you talked about, isn't this trivial, right? Like the whole point of this machine learning was to create easy access to the data for everyone, not just the people that can afford the Bloomberg subscription. And definitely that was the goal. And I think the assumption going in was that would happen. Now, the reality is that life is harder. Life is harder than that. And the data is harder than that. So in the same way, when we think about markets perfectly incorporating price, you look at the models and they have a paragraph where they say, oh, actually, this is kind of, we say it just happens instantaneously, but of course this takes time to kind of sort through and actually happen. The same way with the XBRL, it takes time for people to understand what it looks like and how best to create it. So I remember watching this at the beginning. No one was really sure how to use it, or I would talk to people, and the most sophisticated were the ones that were using it and were using it for themselves. And then I think it was the SEC combined with XBRL US to put out a contest to try to encourage people to create companies that would do exactly what you said, take this and give it to the masses. One of them was CalcBench, and it grew and grew and grew. And now it is a full-grown company and they are providing it, but it still costs money. It's not free because they're incorporating all these different services. So do I think we'll eventually get to the point where it's easy for all investors to get the data? I do. And I think we're on our way there. But I think then there is still the barrier of, wait, what does this mean now? Now I can see the data, but I don't really know how to use it. And you're telling me that there are 3 different kinds of revenue? I don't, just give me the revenue number. I don't know what this means. Whereas someone who is more sophisticated would have a better understanding of how to use this information that's coming out. So XBRL would help, and software, the goal is to make it easily accessible, but it takes software know-how and resources to get it to that point. And that's what we're in that equilibrium creating stage right now, where that data is getting out there. Okay, and then the third piece, this is about, will this incentivize real-time reporting potentially? So that's one possibility, right? The easier you make it to give the data, then the fewer arguments there are against the quarterly or semi-annual or annual reporting structure. Now, the hard part about that is it's one thing to just give you the data, but I would assume that firms would say that the more costly part of this is the vetting of the data, the auditing of the data, or the accounting changes that need to be made on top of the raw data. And so that part, XBRL is not necessarily going to help with unless the company has a very set, structured approach where they just know immediately this kind of transaction will always have this kind of accounting treatment. The reality is, I think most companies are going to have unusual transactions that the accounting group needs to understand and take time to figure out the accounting for. And that would stop the real-time aspect from it to just devolve into that real-time aspect. That, and I think companies would also say, is it helpful, in the same way that we as researchers sometimes say, looking at every year individually might be a little too volatile. Why don't we look at some moving averages? Because you look in too narrow of a band and you're trying to draw conclusions from something that isn't really meaningful. I could see firms again arguing that even if we have the mechanics to provide the information, there are some disadvantages to focusing on too narrow of a band, too narrow of a time period, and trying to draw longer term conclusions from the data in that period. Okay.
Can I just the tiniest follow-up question, which is just, thank you for that really insightful response. If as you describe, it's really a sort of a development of a paradigm and a collaboration between the regulator and these sort of data providers or processors and the firms themselves, can you even put that into a cost-benefit framework to then assess the ongoing? I mean, it seems silly to look at, we spent X on regulatory development this year when we're developing the sort of a community standard that we will only know in 10 years if it's any good. But it's hard to say just because there's a negative balance this year that doesn't actually isn't a relevant data point almost.
No, I would agree. I think it's incredibly difficult. I think that's why you see bills going through Congress trying to say that the smallest firms shouldn't have to do XBRL because it's pure cost. You say, well, I mean, yes, it is now, but the goal is that it won't be in the future and you'll get more investors. And, if you're patient, you might see some benefits, but I would agree. I think it's a very difficult question to answer when all of the costs are in the short run and many of the benefits are in the long run and at kind of this macro level that might be difficult for individual companies to observe as their liquidity becomes better and better, and et cetera. So yes, I think it's difficult.
Very, very exciting area to think about. Also the whole, I think what is extremely helpful to think about this in very simplistic economic terms and just think about, what is an investment? What is marginal cost here? And if there is an investment, is this an investment that can block competition? So can it be, like a natural monopoly eventually arising for the first, let's say, big player that is actually willing to shovel out this investment? So I think this is exciting. And also one thing that you mentioned with regard to the distribution of the costs and benefits across firms, so the small ones and the large ones, obviously might also affect the investors again. So the small investors and the large investors. So it has distributional effects. So so that makes us all very excited. Lots of stuff to do and to think about. So Bianca, thanks for waiting. You would be next. So now we're moving on to a little bit. They're not really big picture questions, but we are becoming broader again. So Bianca, please.
Yeah, hi Elizabeth, and thank you very much for the inspiring presentation, and the pictures made it very easy to follow and to understand. I'm Bianca. I'm a PhD student at ESCP Business School, and my question is more related to the paper you also mentioned published last year with your colleagues, where you mentioned kind of a lack of social media oversight and also potential for misinformation. And I've read that the SEC has provided some, but still some little guidance on social media. So yeah, still there is just few guidance and regulation on this social media part. So I would be very interested in your opinion about, first, how does disclosure through social media change the firm's disclosure landscape? And more importantly, could a stronger regulation of social media disclosure kind of increase transparency, or is it important for you?
Yeah, that's great. So this idea of social media, right? At some level, it's just another, way that firms can communicate, right? In the same way that the website came along and everyone said, what? I don't need to send a press release. I could just put a press release on my website. So social media is just giving them different outlets to provide the information. So in that sense, when the SEC first talked about regulating it, they actually focused first on the website and then said, yes, social media would kind of fall under this purview as well, that look, if you're going to disclose on a different channel, it needs to be done on a channel of communication that is widely recognized as such, that investors know this is where you say things, right? There's nothing inherently better about press release distribution channels over websites, over social media, other than that we've used press release distribution wires for longer than we had used the website and for longer than we had used social media. And two, with more social media, there are more options, right? Are they going to be on Twitter or on Facebook or on LinkedIn? What will this look like? So in that sense, the regulation is given a lot of freedom and flexibility to companies, but still required them to say which channel they're going to use. In response, companies typically just don't disclose new things on social media channels. They'll disseminate more on those channels, but they'll still disclose it through the more traditional, through the SEC filings, through a website, through press releases. I think it will be interesting to see how, obviously the disclosure patterns are changing, they're shifting, because it's not just another website. It has its own features. It allows you to, live tweet the earnings announcement as it's happening. It allows you to interact with investors, to provide pictures. I mean, like, is a picture new information if it's just illustrating the written words that were already provided? So I think the more that social media's capabilities and characteristics draw firms away from the classic disclosure patterns, the more that the regulators will probably start to think, oh, wait, is this changing the way things are done? And do we need to do something, step in to protect investors? I think that's their ultimate goal, is to protect investors. And so if you end up having a CEO that uses social media to, provide new private information that really isn't true, the SEC will step in and will say, this is not appropriate for various reasons. So I do think that social media will continue to evolve, and firms' disclosure will continue to evolve somewhat along with it. I'm unsure how regulation will change with it, right? My guess is that they will still try to leave firms the flexibility to adjust and adapt to whatever is coming, because you can't regulate on an instant when you see social media changing. And I say that, and yet, we've seen the SEC start to question this idea of Reddit, where it's not firm disclosure, it's investors talking with each other and potentially spurring this investment that really isn't investment, but it's speculation or it's collusion, or I don't know what it is. And so I think the answer would be regulators, they're going to keep a close eye on this. I think in the end, the regulation is best done at a broad level or at a flexible level to be able to accommodate changes in that social media over time, because it is nuanced and it is difficult to monitor that. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have two follow-up questions in the chat that directly relate to this. So Jan, I think Jan Seitz, you mentioned talk. So I guess that you are willing to talk. So Jan, here.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your talk on disclosure channels. Very interesting. I have a follow-up question. Do you have any evidence or bigger empirical evidence whether dissemination via social media channels is used by managers for opportunistic behavior? And on top of that, which characteristics of these disclosure channels on social media do you think drive the suitability for opportunistic behavior? Do you think there are some specific determinants of that channels, like how big the social network is and so on?
Yeah, so there hasn't been a lot of research on this, right? There's the Young et al. Paper that looked at a Twitter sample kind of in the late, 2014 to 2018 range. And they found that managers were more likely to tweet good news than bad news, right? So when you don't have to tweet everything. And so they found that marginally more likely to do that. So that you could structure that, you could talk about it as strategic, right? They're choosing to do that. There hasn't been more, I haven't seen more evidence in other arenas or in other things. And when we did our first paper on Twitter, we didn't see strategic dissemination like that. I think because it was the first couple of years and no one really knew what they were doing and they were just trying to figure things out. So in that sense, it could still be that in other social media, firms are still trying to figure it out. It could also be that, there have been some regulatory actions against manipulation on these platforms, right? There have been a few examples of pretty blatant manipulation, and the SEC has definitely stepped in and taken action, which would discourage companies from doing more of that. I think there's been some interesting experimental work that's been done looking at what if managers did this, what might the response be? But we haven't done that much empirical research to tease out how much of this could be manipulation or use of these channels by managers. I think it's an interesting area to look at more, difficult, but interesting.
Yeah, I also think very interesting topic. But do you think there are characteristics of the channels, like difference between Twitter and Facebook and Reddit maybe, which drive that possibility of opportunistic behavior, or do you think that's not really the case, that the manager is still looking for how to use those channels?
Yeah. I guess I don't know. I think that managers are still trying to, one hand, they are still trying to figure out how to do these things. Two, not all managers are looking for ways to manipulate. Okay. Many of them are simply trying to get the message across. Three, I think that the ones where they would, if I had to pick a feature, it would be where they're able to discreetly do it, right? So if it's a platform where everything is, it's very obvious. So like the example of Twitter, if it's very obvious which ones they do and don't tweet, then you wouldn't see that strategic tweeting. What makes it interesting is that you don't see the full set of possible items. It's just whatever they end up saying. I could also see, depending on the length or the ability, the expectation for explanation, right? The context of what is acceptable and what is not, in terms of, if you use very, outlandishly excited language, you do that in a press release, people would say, what are you doing? You do it in some of these different forums and they say, oh yeah, of course, everyone does this. So part of it is the context and expectation, kind of the social norms within that platform. If they allow or encourage more exaggerated language, that would be an opportunity for managers to jump in and use it in that way.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Then, so we can do a bet on when the first CEO has an earnings announcement with a lot of rockets in on Reddit, saying, "Oh, we're going to the moon here." Okay, so Simon Harry has a follow-up question that I think is really interesting. Not that the other questions weren't interesting, obviously. Simon.
Thank you, Joachim. Thank you, Olympus, for this great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So when I read your literature review and also looked at the previous literature, a lot of authors seem to look at either what the firm discloses, or this one paper by Bartov where they look at, okay, can we actually predict announcement returns, but then as an aggregate measure. But when I actually look at the characteristics of such a social network such as Twitter, and also other networks I think are very similar, then we see that only a handful of users have a lot of the followers and a lot of the influence actually on the network itself. So if I'm with 2 Twitter followers post something about some firm-specific information, no one's going to listen to me. So do you think this is something we need to account for when we do this kind of research? Because I sometimes have the feeling we disregard that there are some very powerful users that can steer the discussion in one way or the other, and this will also interact with our results that we find them.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the Chen et al. Paper, they look at in Seeking Alpha, how many articles the author has written and how many followers they have as a sense for what is their influence, what is their potential influence, and does that does that mean either one, that what they're saying is better because they gather more investors, or two, what they're saying is going to spread farther? And that's what the JAE paper that I talked about on merger rumors on Twitter, they looked at, okay, let's look in general, an aggregate of if there's a rumor that's on Twitter and it gets more activity, does that end up kind of distorting prices more? And then they see when they were tweeted by someone with more followers, more influence, is that distortion exacerbated? Is it greater? And the answer is yes. So, yes, I think that the current research has already started to incorporate that. And I would encourage, future research that it needs to acknowledge that Twitter is not this, or any of these social media websites, they have different individuals with more or less influence and more or less credibility. And that is part of what makes it really interesting to study, that we can see much more clearly than we could without those, right? Without that, even you think about newspaper articles, you just assume that the ones from the larger outlets get more following, get more attention. With social media, we can see which ones get more attention, and that should definitely be part of research design.
Perfect. So now we are moving on to the, let's say, meta questions. So the first question was also brought up by Lisa, who unfortunately cannot be asking the question herself today. And it was more a general question about textual analysis. So we've seen your study on textual analysis. We've seen more and more studies now also using topic modeling approaches and moving away a little bit from the bag of words approaches. So what is your take on this method in terms of, is it around for good? Will it stick? Will it evolve? Yeah. So what do you think?
Textual analysis?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, definitely. So, accounting, we usually think of it as numbers, because that is what the standards, that is a core part of what we do. But the standards also talk about words, and numbers completely devoid of words are meaningless. So we definitely, we have to say that this number 200 is cash, right? There's a word. And we often then need to explain further. We need to talk about the assumptions. And so that's embedded in these accounting standards because it's informative, because it's part of that communication. So the more that we're able to parse that out, whether it's one, using it just for research, where we want to find a certain number or a certain piece of information. So we need to be able to quickly and easily search through the filings to find it. That was something that before, the person either picked a small sample or spent a lot of time, or really picked a small sample and spent a lot of time trying to find the piece of information that they wanted. Now we can do that more quickly with textual analysis, so that it can be just a strictly research tool. But the other aspect, kind of the more interesting, is that in analyzing it, that is another whole set of information that we can understand. And, I think one, do we just use this bag of words? Do we go into now the machine learning analysis, whether it's looking at tone, whether it's looking at complexity, whether it's trying to assess what topics and categories they're talking about? I think it's all very interesting, and it will definitely continue because there is information to be found in there. Now, what I hope is that the research is done thoughtfully, and we use the tools as they should be used, and we caveat the tools for the caveats that they require, right? That this is not this beautiful gift that is perfect, but rather there are advantages and disadvantages with every tool. There are assumptions built in. There are ways to try to validate. So I think along the whole process is to acknowledge the tool for what it is, talk about what it can tell us and what it can't tell us, but then definitely get into the language. I think that is such a core part of firms' communication.
Thank you. I also, if I may add, also one thing that I see from reading the literature and also dealing with the methodology a little bit is that I would like to see more stuff that actually uses the structural information that we have from accounting within the analysis. It sometimes seems weird that we use methods that don't incorporate our domain knowledge about how this is actually being structured. Yeah, so whenever we can bring this together, I think then really great things can happen, because accounting language is different from prose. So, and I think every linguist would say, okay, I have to pre-process this, so to make this a little bit more normal. And I think this is where we can really also help as domain experts, because we are accountants in the end, we are not computer scientists. Wonderful. So now we have a question by Ulrich, which also is a little bit broader, but I think it's also worth thinking about. So Ulrich, please go.
Yes, hi, good morning. And my name is Ulrich. I'm a first-year PhD student here at New York University. It's great to meet you, after reading your name on so many papers. And I'm working on a project relating to Regulation AB2, which deals with loan-level disclosures of asset-backed securities in the US. And one question that came up is there such a thing as too much transparency? And, there are these examples you mentioned, and for example, that, I don't know, there might be some adverse selection because unsophisticated lender drop out and, with effects on liquidity, et cetera, And I want to know from you, what do you think, purely subjective, what's like the best empirical example or the best sort of bit of evidence that shows there's too much transparency in a market or somewhere?
Oh, this is, you throw the best question out there. I need to think about what would be the best piece of evidence. I mean, immediately, the arguments, at least, that I think about for why you could have too much transparency is this idea when you have, obviously, a trade secret, you release the information, it materially affects the firm, right? So this proprietary cost argument. Another one would be that if you release information too early, in an incomplete fashion, then you have volatile response that's not informative, right? You're going to overreact, underreact. It is going to continue to go up and down like that. I see those as kind of like, those are the two big arguments that come to mind for over transparency in that sense. I don't know what I would say is like I can't think of this off the top of my head.
And that's also a little bit unfair to ask for the best thing. So one thing that always comes to my mind when somebody brings it up is risk sharing. So I'm a big fan of risk sharing. And in order to be able to share risks, you have to be insecure whether they strike or not, right? So think about health insurance. If we would be completely transparent about our health risks. Yeah, so that market will break down, and that will be a bad thing to happen. And then there is another super interesting study, which I haven't read, but I know that it exists, from a sociologist that looked into political parties. And there was an experiment with a German party, Die Piraten, for all the Germans in here, which tried to be super transparent on their internal processes. So, every debate was supposed to be in the open. And we know from Die Piraten that they're not doing this well nowadays. And one of the reasons, at least people speculated about this, because they had no, let's say, opacity in which they could fight. Yeah, so everything was transparent, and even the little quibbles were blown completely out of proportion. And that's about organizational transparency, if you want, right? So you have these aspects of organizational transparency where a little bit of a closed door atmosphere maybe might help in some organizations or the others. But as I said, I didn't read this paper. I only looked at the abstract, but it sounded very interesting.
That sounds interesting that it's like related to proprietary costs in the sense that you want it to go to certain parties, but not others. Yeah. And to the effect that you can selectively disclose certain information that's helpful, as opposed to letting everyone know all of the details.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I have still 1 minute for a last question, if I may. So the one that I hold back, if that's okay with everybody, otherwise do. Okay. So about average effects versus effects across the universal firms. I really think that average effects are what we should care about in this field. But I see findings like, for example, on average, firms have the information used in roadshows is actually informative about future profitability. I always think about, well, is there a pocket in the cross section somewhere where the opposite holds? And so, because everything is becoming so heterogeneous nowadays, and we talked about all these different disclosure channels and different costs and benefits, do you think that it would be worthwhile looking into these pockets, or do you think that the average effects are, because in the end, the average matters more than some extremes, that we should focus on the average effects?
I think it's very interesting to look at the pockets. I mean, I think of this cross-sectionally. I mean, on one hand, the basic concept of doing a cross-sectional test is going to allow you to confirm if you can do it based on a characteristic that helped motivate your prediction, right? If you think, X causes Y because of this other feature, and then you look to see, well, as this other feature varies, when it gets stronger, you see the effect more, then that helps to, one, substantiate the initial prediction that led to the on average effect. So in that sense, it's about further providing evidence of the effect. But the second is that, yes, there is nothing more frustrating than having people say, oh, yes, this is what happens. And you say, well, no, that is what happens on average. That is not what happens everywhere and every time. And that can increase the plausibility of the outcomes, right? You're not trying to say that it's always more informative. You're trying to say that on average, it's more informative. In some cases, it'd be more or less. So I think that doing the cross-sectional tests, using different characteristics to help explain where it would be higher or lower, that's great. And then I think the caveat is to make sure that you have a sample size that's big enough to handle it, and the right variable that you're looking at in the cross section, right? That you're not just, I wouldn't want to just throw everything at it and then say, yes, see, it varies by this, but to rather do some targeted, focused analysis to split it out. And then ideally, even, you can look at one subsample and then delve into that more further, with the hope of having either insights for companies or investors or regulators. So yeah, I think that's all interesting.
Thank you. And sorry for asking the last question here, forcing you a little bit over time, because I know that you have to teach. I'm feeling bad about myself now, but I was carried away because it was also interesting. So I think I speak for all of us if I just say thank you a lot, Beth, for doing this. This was extremely insightful. So we all know now that you're not just a great researcher, you're also an awesome teacher. So that was really, really impressive. And also the way that you handled the questions, wow. Okay, so thanks to all of you guys for showing up. That was really nice. So we didn't do some text questions, but what I can say is in 2 weeks' time, we're gonna have Martin Jakob here talking about tax and tax transparency. And then it's becoming very political because we will be talking about inequality and all the unfairness of the world through the eyes of the tax accountant. Until then, enjoy your time. And those of you that want to take credits, we're going to see you in the Q&A on Wednesday. But then we will have a guest as well talking about how to write blog posts. Yeah, so because this is an assignment. So see you around, everybody. And Beth, again, thanks and have fun teaching. Sorry.
All right, thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.